Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Bible by the Week. We are into the last week of Jesus' life. We left off last week with his entry into Palm Sunday, and that's where we start this week in Mark's account in chapter 11, in which Jesus rides into Jerusalem on a donkey in fulfillment of prophecy about the Messiah arriving on a donkey, on the foal of a donkey. The idea being he would come as a king, not riding a war horse, but a king coming in peace. Which is the equivalent of riding a donkey, kind of like the difference between riding into town on a tank and riding into town on a convertible. It gives a totally different signal. And of course, he's hailed by the waving of palm branches, and people shout Hosanna, which means save or save us. And they say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the son of David. So they're hailing him as the Messiah, the predicted one. Interestingly, in Mark's gospel, Jesus is staying outside of Jerusalem and Bethany, kind of in the suburbs, because there's only so much room in the city. And the next day on his way in, he sees a fig tree, which he curses because it hasn't produced fruit yet. And this is a sign of the people of Israel have not produced the fruit that God had expected and required from them. This is taken right out of the prophets, but Jesus actually acts this out. And when he gets to town, this sign is really fulfilled in that he comes to the temple and there are merchants who are exploiting the people by requiring them to buy only the certified sacrificial animals that have been approved by the priests, which are at a much higher price than anything they could bring from home. And they're doing this in the court of the Gentiles, so they're excluding the non-Jewish people from God's temples, and this enrages Jesus. He has a righteous anger, and he drives them out. A day later, they pass the same fig tree he cursed, and the tree has withered, and the disciples are really struck by that. And Jesus tells his disciples that they are to have faith in what God is doing. And he also tells them that they need to forgive their brothers before they offer sacrifices, that you can't just have a relationship with God and be wrong with your brother, that your relationship with God is affected by the way that you treat other people. So his authority is questioned by the religious leaders, and Jesus stumps them by asking, whose son is the Messiah? Because David talks about the Messiah as being his son and his Lord. And of course, you would never have a Lord in the culture of Jesus' day. You would never have a Lord who was younger than their parent figure. And, they're just stumped by this reference from the Old Testament. They have no answer for that. But of course, it fits Jesus because he was both David's descendant and David's Lord. In chapter 12, Jesus tells a parable about some vineyard tenants who farm the vineyard, but they don't produce or don't give the share of the crops that the owner of the vineyard has required. And this vineyard idea goes straight back to Isaiah. Isaiah used this of Israel. And Jesus says that what the landlord will do, he sends servant after servant. They beat some and kill others. And finally, he sends their son and they kill the landlord's son. And so Jesus asks, so what's the landlord going to do? Well, he's going to drive those tenants out and punish them and bring in new tenants who will produce the fruit of the vineyard. And of course, Jesus' hearers, the religious leaders, can't stand this because they know that the vineyard is Israel. And they understand that Jesus is talking about taking away God's blessing on Israel and giving it to those who will produce the fruit of righteousness. Jesus is asked about taxes. Is it right to give taxes to Caesar or not? This is a trap because, some of them, the Herodians, support the Romans, and others, the Pharisee, believes that's a betrayal of Israel. And Jesus, neatly sidesteps that by saying, well, give to God what's God's, and to, Caesar what is Caesar. He then schools the Sadducees who are trying to trap him in a question that makes the resurrection sound ridiculous. And he shows from the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, the only ones that the Sadducees recognize, that God is the God of the living. And he says that he's the God, is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, meaning that they're still alive. So therefore, there must be a resurrection. Jesus is asked what the greatest commandment is, and he says, the greatest is love the Lord your God with everything you got, and the second greatest is love your neighbor as yourself. Those are the top 2. He warns against the self-serving religious teachers, and in contrast, he praises a widow who's coming into the temple, and she gives just 2 small pennies, but it's everything she has to live on. So some people claim to serve God, and they're respected for serving God, and yet they're actually in it for themselves. And here's this widow that nobody else would notice, who's giving everything that she has. She's the one who's truly devoted to God. In chapter 13, Jesus predicts the destruction of the temple, and this shocks his disciples, not just because it's taken 46 years to build, but because this is the house of God. This is the holy temple where God's promised to be present for his people. And so they ask 2 questions. When will this happen, and what are the signs that the end is coming, basically? And they're 2 different questions, but it's kind of hard to sort through this a little bit. Jesus tells them that there will be false messiahs, there will be persecution, there will be betrayal, and the abomination that causes desolation, which is a reference to in between the testaments when Antiochus Epiphanes, the Greek leader, had actually sacrificed a pig and desecrated the temple, which caused the Hasmonean uprising and a brief period of Jewish independence. But that this is going to happen again, that there's going to be a leader who's going to desecrate the temple, and that when that happens, his followers, Mark tells us, need to flee to out of Jerusalem. This actually would happen 40 years after Jesus in AD 70. This would happen, and the Christians, the followers of Jesus, would in fact flee Jerusalem and save their lives. Then Jesus predicts that his return will come without warning at the end of the age. So this is the second part of the question, not when will the temple be destroyed, but what are the signs of his return? It's going to come without warning, he says. He urges everyone to keep watch. At Bethany, back in the suburbs, Jesus' feet are anointed by a woman with perfume, and she's criticized for using this expensive perfume when the money could have been given to the poor, but he defends her, saying that this woman has anointed me for my burial. Always on his mind are what's actually going to happen that week. And this, we're told, leads to Judas betraying Jesus, because we're told that Judas is actually the treasurer of the disciples, and he wanted some of that money, and he thinks, oh, this Jesus just doesn't know how to manage his campaign here. So it goes on to, in Mark, the Passover celebration in an upper room, Jesus predicting that all of his disciples will abandon him. Peter, of course, says, no, I'll never do that. These other guys might. But Jesus warns him that before the cock crows 3 times, that he will, he will 3 times betray him. But Jesus also gives, in Mark's account, communion. He alters the Passover Seder, the formula or ritual of the Passover, in order to tell his disciples in this object lesson that he would redeem them through his own body and blood. And on their way to Gethsemane, the Garden of Gethsemane, where they're going after the Passover, Jesus predicts that his followers, as I said, will fall away. Peter will disown him. At the garden, they can't even stay awake. Of course, they've had a big meal and a lot of wine, but Jesus is stressed. He's anticipating his crucifixion and his betrayal, and he prays for his Father's will to be done, while his disciples, whom he's asked to pray, are actually sleeping. Some thugs show up, the temple guard, to arrest Jesus. Somebody cuts off a servant's ear. It's not so clear in Mark that it's Peter, but we know that. And Jesus will end up healing that ear. And then we're told this peculiar thing that there's a young man there witnessing all of this who runs away. The soldiers try to grab him and pull off his cloak, and so he runs away naked. And we think, why is that in there? And the theory is that that young man was John Mark, the author of this gospel. And he puts this in there as a little bit of a nod to the fact that he was an eyewitness, at least to this part of the story, because as one would guess, it's likely that this story was known about him. And so it's his way of saying, yeah, I was there. It's not something you would brag about, but it's, about the only really good theory as to why this particular sentence is in this account. Jesus is taken to the high priest. He affirms that he is the Messiah and the Son of God, and then he's condemned to die for blasphemy. Meanwhile, out in the courtyard, John has gotten Peter in. He's with the servants around the fire, and he disowns Jesus 3 times, as was predicted. Now, in John's Gospel, chapter 12, we have this story of Jesus anointed in Bethany, and we're told that the woman's name is Mary, not necessarily Mary Magdalene. There were a lot of women named Mary. John tells us that Judas objected because he was a thief. John is actually the hardest on Judas of all of the gospel accounts. He cites Zechariah 9, verse 9 to explain Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem. John notes that some Greek Jews came because they wanted to see Jesus. And this is a sign to Jesus that what was predicted is happening. People are coming from around the world to be part of his kingdom. He predicts that his death will produce many seeds that will glorify his Father. And the Father speaks from heaven and affirms Jesus' sacrifice in this voice that, yes, he is glorifying Jesus even through his death. The crowd wonders how Jesus can claim that he's going to be lifted up when the Messiah should reign forever. That lifted up term can also be used of being impaled, as in nailed to a cross. And Jesus urges that they trust in his light. Many of the Jews reject Jesus, but he continues to insist that he speaks for the Father and that he came not to judge the world, but to save the world. Now, in Matthew's account, we read chapter 22, where Jesus tells this parable, this story of a wedding banquet that's thrown by a king, but all the people that were invited, all the privileged, have excuses why they just can't do it. They have other things that are more important to them. And so the king sends out his servants to bring in the commoners, the highways and the byways, and they are invited to the banquet. It's a clear story about those who should be part of God's kingdom, but have other priorities, missing out on this wedding banquet that God has prepared, and people that would seem to be unworthy are invited in. And they're given clothes. We might think that's strange, but at weddings in Jesus' day, if you were wealthy, you would give gifts to your guest. And one of the most appreciated gifts was a new set of clothes because it was expensive. A lot of people, especially the commoners, wouldn't have had another set of clothes, and they certainly wouldn't have had anything clean or worthy of a wedding banquet. And so this is a great gift, but there's one guy who refuses to put on the clean clothes, and so he gets tossed out. And the message is that you have to put on the righteousness that God provides to be worthy of celebrating in his kingdom. And if you reject that righteousness, you've rejected God. Jesus deals with questions, as mentioned, about taxes, the resurrection, what's the greatest commandment, and he asks whose son the Christ is. He insists that the greatest in his kingdom are the ones who serve, and then he declares judgment on those who are blind, not physically blind, but spiritually blind, the hypocrites, the legalists, and the Pharisees. He has compassion on Jerusalem because as he enters the city, he foresees that it's going to be destroyed. It's destroyed for its own sins and rejection of him, and yet he's not gloating about that. He's actually sad. This is the attitude of God towards those who are lost. Jesus is asked about the temple destruction and his coming, and Jesus warns that there will be wars and famines and earthquakes, but these are just the beginning of the birth pangs, right? Just like the beginning of the labor does not mean the baby's coming any minute. That there will be persecution and betrayal and cold-heartedness to follow, but the gospel must be preached to all nations before the end. There are people that take this very literally today, and there are organizations that are working to reach all the unreached language groups in the world, believing that they can actually trigger Jesus coming back through that, which is, a noble goal. Whether that's exactly the way things work, we don't know. But, God bless them, because we want to bring the gospel to all nations, and the end of the world would not be a bad thing for those of us who trust in Jesus. Jesus warns his followers to flee the abomination in the temple. Again, this abomination that causes desolation, and to ignore the false messiahs. And there would, by the way, historically be several false messiahs that followed Jesus, and this would actually lead to the Roman destruction of Jerusalem and of the temple. Jesus goes on to talk about how his return, no one's going to miss it. It's going to be like lightning that travels from the east to the west. You can be on the other side of the house and still not miss a lightning strike that happens. And that's how it's going to be. No one will be able to miss the end of the world. Here, just his followers to watch for the signs, but says that no one knows the day or the hour. He doesn't even know. So you should always serve faithfully. Always assume that the Lord could be coming back today. Jesus illustrates the end of the world with a number of parables, one about some virgins that the wise ones have extra oil for their lamps as they await the bridegroom to come and the wedding to start, and the others don't bring enough. They run out of oil, have to go get more, and while they're gone, the celebration starts and they're shut out of it because they weren't prepared. He tells one of servants that are given talents, which is a unit of weight of silver, to invest while their master is gone, and the faithful ones invest it, and the unfaithful ones just sit on it and are just passive. He tells about a parable about a judgment. In the end, God's judgment being like the separating of sheep and goats, which were pastured together, but before the sheep were sheared, they would be separated. And that's how it's going to be in the end. And there are people who they might have hung out in the church, and they might be unrecognizable to other goats or sheep as to which one they are, but God knows. And the message is that it's not enough to pay lip service to God or just attend. God knows who actually is living out his gospel, who's actually taken it into their hearts and is living in response to it, just like the shepherd knows how to separate the sheep and the goats. Jesus is anointed in Bethany. Again, he performs the Lord's Supper, we call it, the changing of the Passover into what we call communion service. He predicts his betrayal, he's betrayed, he's arrested, he's deserted, and he's tried before the Sanhedrin, the Jewish ruling council, where he affirms his identity as the Son of God. But of course, he at the same time is disowned by Peter, the one who pledged that he would never leave him. Finally, we get to Luke's gospel, where in chapter 20, Jesus stumps those who question his authority. He tells the parable of the tenants, deals with questions on taxes and the resurrection, asks those who are there whose son the Christ is, and warns of hypocritical legalists. In 21, he affirms the widow's offering and predicts the temple's destruction. He warns his followers to ignore false messiahs and to treat natural disasters as warnings that an end will someday come. First, though, he says persecution will come, but he's going to give here's the promise, he's going to give his followers the words to say and will protect them when they are persecuted. They can only harm the body. They can't take away their eternal salvation. He does warn again, when Jerusalem surrounded, his followers should flee the city, and says that all creation will evidence his return, so his followers should keep watch. The near-term disasters will happen within a generation, so his followers should be wise. That's not to confuse, and it is kind of confusing for us to read through this, which of these disasters Jesus was predicting as near-term as opposed to the end of the world, which they point to. So that's where we quit for this week, with Jesus having been tried and convicted. This coming week, we'll be reading the account of his passion, his execution on the cross. So not something to look forward to, but of course the result is what we always remember about it. We keep in mind that this is the story of God's love for us and of our liberation, which God himself paid the price for. So I hope that you, I don't know if I want to say enjoy, but I hope that it's highly meaningful for you as you read these next passages. The Lord be with you.